Hi, this is Frank Gavin, the director of the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins, and we're thrilled to have you back for the first panel of our World Order After COVID-19 forum. Particularly excited about this panel to start off this conference. As many of you know, the Kissinger Center, inspired by its namesake, Dr. Henry Kissinger, has been very dedicated to the notion of using the lessons of history to better understand the present and prepare for the future. And so this session, Applied History and Future Scenarios, is a perfect way to get started. And I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague, Angus Bergen, who's a terrific historian from Johns Hopkins Department of History, who's done a lot of really terrific work, author of The Great Persuasion, Reinventing Free Markets Since the Depression, and also has a fascinating project that he's working on now about the technological revolution since the Second World War, which obviously fits in very nicely with what we're doing over the next 2 days and with Dr. Eric Schmidt's comments. So thrilled to have you all here, and thank you, Angus, and I'll turn it over to you.
Everyone to the panel on Applied History and Future Scenarios. We have an excellent lineup of presenters, all of whom have extensive experience in different realms and thinking about how history can inform our actions in the present. So I'll just make a few very brief introductions before we dive straight into the papers. So let me just make a couple of notes at the outset. All of our panelists will speak for roughly 7 to 10 minutes, and I'll do my best to enforce that as rigorously as I can. And I also want to remind the audience to please post questions as you're listening to the papers. We'll be aggregating them, and in addition to asking a couple of questions of my own at the end, I'm going to be pulling out what you have to say to get our panelists to speak more deeply to the arguments they begin to develop here. So today we're going to begin with Graham Allison, followed by Philip Bobbitt, Jeremy Green, and Dora Varga, Neil Ferguson, and Margaret McMillan. I'll make just a brief note of introduction before each panelist speaks. So let's begin with Graham Allison. Professor Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he served as the founding dean of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. His first book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis from 1971, has more than 500,000 copies in print. And his most recent book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap, was a national and international bestseller, and he'll be speaking on some related themes in his paper today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Allison.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished panel, and I congratulate Frank and the Kissinger Institute for organizing such an extraordinary session. So trying to think about history and coronavirus and the consequences for world order should leave us all a bit humble. I think anybody that's not been confused and surprised by recent events probably hasn't been watching, but nonetheless, I'll offer thoughts as best I can. I see coronavirus like a bolt of lightning that illuminates the landscape, the distant horizons for an instant, horizons that would otherwise be obscured. And I think the primary impact of this pandemic will not, let me say not, fundamentally alter international politics as we've known it, or world order as we've known it, but will instead highlight 3 central realities of the world order and disorder we've been trying to deal with. First and most fundamentally, coronavirus magnifies the underlying structural reality that'll be the defining feature of world order and disorder for as far as any eye can see. In what we're coming to recognize as a great rivalry, a rising China is seriously threatening to displace a ruling US from its accustomed position at the top of every pecking order. And Eric Schmidt's very candid reminder about what's happening in the technological space was very helpful in this regard, and mostly not appreciated by most students of international affairs who haven't noticed how rapidly a rising China has actually come to challenge and even replace the US in many arenas, including in technology, which we think of as a natural birthright. So in 12 of 16 cases over the last 500 years, such Thucydidean and rivalries have ended in war. So first, a Thucydidean rivalry. Secondly, despite the inevitable and inescapable rivalry, coronavirus, I think, is also providing a vivid reminder that each nation faces external threats it cannot defeat by itself acting alone. However unnatural, however uncomfortable, each, I think, must come to recognize the other as what I've called its insufferable but inseparable Siamese or conjoined twin. As American and Russian Cold Warriors, of whom I'm an old one, learned painfully, neither could survive a nuclear war. Survival required the adversaries, both adversaries, to constrain their competition. So we've seen a version of this before, but it's going to be much more so. Third and finally, in my three big points, this deadly pathogen has condemned the US and China, despite their hostility, to work together, at least to the extent necessary to ensure their national survival and well-being. In their search for a new strategic rationale for this relationship, perhaps they can find their way to some combination of an ancient Chinese concept of rivalry partners that Eric has already introduced, and an insight John Kennedy came to after having survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he, at the Johns Hopkins commencement speech in 1963, called for the US and the Soviet Union to coexist in what he called a, quote, world safe for diversity. So I think each of these three realities is best understood through the lens of applied history, the venture that Neil and I launched some time ago that's now become a movement that I'm applauding, but that Thucydides started sometime before we got to the party. This is the explicit attempt to illuminate current challenges and choices by analyzing the historical record. And if I take the theme through this conference, the question raised about how substantially coronavirus will change order and world politics as we've known it. I think if Thucydides were tweeting, he would say much less than most people are expecting. So Thucydides' big idea was that as long as human beings are human beings, the future will resemble the past more or less. So I think about the current debate about the transformation of the world order or disorder by coronavirus, Thucydides would likely remind us of the analogous proclamations that were made about the end of history at the end of the Cold War, which you now cannot read without smiling, even though many of us were somewhat infected by the ideas. I think even Thucydides would contest the great Henry Kissinger in his proposition that, quote, the coronavirus pandemic will forever alter the world order and require a new post-coronavirus order. I think he would reject Richard Haas's claim that, quote, today and for the century ahead, the most significant threats that we face are less other states than a range of transnational problems. I think he would not agree with my colleague Larry Summers' proposition that in the post-coronavirus world, we will, quote, live in a world where security depends more on cooperation with allies and adversaries alike than on maintaining a balance of power. And I think Thucydides would find the great awakening that's been announced in many quarters, especially among Europeans, that hails enlightened leaders embracing the solidarity of 7.7 billion inhabitants of planet Earth, creating a new one world vaccine and burying petty nationalisms in a new era of globalism, I think Thucydides might say delusional. So I think a huge level of skepticism here. Let me take my remaining 3 minutes to make another comment about each of the three big insights. First, on the Thucydidean rivalry, I've written about that, so I don't think I need to repeat to a group like this who knows Thucydides better than I do. But Thucydides always started with the deep structural factors. And the deep structural factors in this case are a meteoric rising China that has, over the past generation, come to be a serious rival of the US in virtually every dimension.
Which of these would you like? Bible or Holy Bible King James plus audio?
No. Sorry, excuse me. Somebody else is talking here. I have too many machines. So the first proposition about a Thucydidean rivalry, Thucydides reminded us that actually there are three layers of this. First, there's the reality, which is bad enough. A China that's actually the number one trading partner of everybody. A China that's now a peer competitor in AI. A China that's now ahead of the US in facial recognition, ahead of the US in voice recognition, and many other arenas. Secondly, there's the perception and psychology that this, in which perceptions, misperceptions, and emotions often create what Thucydides called a, quote, fear that instilled in Sparta. And finally, even Thucydides has this third level that we're seeing so vividly displayed right now in American politics, in which in the partisan domestic politics, the axiom says, never let an adversary get to the right of you on a serious issue of national security. So you see in the US a competition now to who will be the least soft on Chinese communism and who will be the toughest on China. This then gets you to what, again, Eric already introduced, the notion of one coronavirus, two systems, and two systems responses. And I think, again, most of us remain somewhat in denial about the extent to which China has successfully dealt with the coronavirus, on the one hand, and substantially in denial about the failures of our system at virtually every level in dealing with coronavirus. So we shouldn't forget that there's a big meta-narrative here in the Chinese account of events, which is a story of the inevitable rise of China and the irreversible decline of the US. So that, I think, is playing out in the coronavirus crisis. Secondly, briefly, nonetheless, we have a version of mini-MAD, I call it, mini mutual assured MAD, but not destruction, but defeat. Coronavirus, since no state can hermetically seal its borders, even if it's eliminated in one state, can be reintroduced. So until there's a vaccine, there's no ultimate solution. In the pursuit of the vaccine, there's quite a lot in which we can learn from the Chinese and the Chinese can learn from us. And I mentioned that. Third, finally, the rivalry partnership. I think Eric introduced the idea. It sounds like a contradiction, especially for diplomats. It feels like a contradiction. But as Eric points out, in the business world, it's sometimes called life. So I think when the alternative is destruction or defeat, the possibility of relationships that are difficult and painful and maybe even unnatural, we demonstrated in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, could produce a set of constraints that allowed a competition peacefully. And I would hope we might do so in this case.
All right, thanks very much to Professor Allison. This is just a brief reminder to please post any questions you might have about Professor Allison's remarks, and I'll raise them at the end. So in the meantime, I'm going to turn to Philip Bobbitt, Herbert Bachelor, Professor of Federal Jurisprudence, Columbia Law School, and the author of 10 books, including the award-winning The Shield of Achilles and the international best-selling Terror and Consent. His most recent work was a very timely new edition of The Authoritative Impeachment, a handbook, first written in 1974 by first Columbia Law professor Charles Black. So I'll turn it over to Professor Bobbitt.
Would be the removal of the U.S. from its leading role. That wouldn't come because of COVID-19, but because of something deeper and more profound that is reflected in the way the U.S. has responded to the COVID-19 crisis. Imagine for a moment that the United States did not face a public health crisis caused by a pandemic, or a crisis in the fragility of its financial institutions, or a democracy crisis, or a climate change crisis, or a crisis in race relations or growing inequality. What we do have is a crisis of change, or more precisely, a crisis of managing change that has delegitimated the constitutional order of industrial nation states everywhere. It is this crisis that converts these other challenges into crises themselves. It is this change that must be managed before the others can be dealt with successfully. Our failure to do so has been a failure of imagination. The constitutional order of industrial nation states is in the process of being supplanted by that of informational market states, in part because the latter can better cope with the threats I've just mentioned, including the pandemic, because it can better manage change on a global scale. It is a better manager of the kinds of change we face in the 21st century because it seeks to work with the market rather than replace it, as did the constitutional order of industrial nation states. If there's a silver lining to the COVID-19 cloud, it is the astonishing international cooperation in research, sharing of data, vaccine, knowledge, and potential manufacture that has occurred outside the apparatus of states and international political institutions. The United States has already adopted various piecemeal reforms that we can see in retrospect reflect this emerging informational market state. When the state goes from reliance on regulation and legal institutions so characteristic of the industrial nation state to deregulating not only industries, but far more importantly, women's reproduction. When the state moves from conscription to an all-volunteer force to raise armies, when state-owned enterprises are replaced by sovereign wealth funds, when regimes of market democracy like referenda, recall votes, and voter initiatives that circumvent parliamentary practices and traditional systems of representation become widespread. When these developments occur, we are seeing the stirring of a nascent constitutional order. One of the salient features of this new order is that it treats citizens as consumers. And this is true across all races, classes, and political parties. It has been said that the only valid purpose of the state is to create the citizen, which means if the citizen is simply a customer, adding value to the lives of those persons who are both the subject and the sovereign of the democratic state. Because the state has a monopoly on law, value can be created by constitutional innovation, like varying the states in a federal system to offer what individuals and groups desire. Let me give you one scenario for the future of the constitutional order of the United States that would have the greatest impact on world order. It's not an international event, but a domestic one. The greatest political threat to the United States today, to which the COVID-19 pandemic has given momentum, lies in a fissioning of American constitutional rights, a chain reaction set off within the very structure of federalism that was designed to protect the state against such a collapse. It looks like this. At present, with one dramatic exception, constitutional rights are normalized across the various states. Today, if you're arrested for shoplifting in Detroit, you'll read the same Miranda rights a shoplifter gets in Miami. And indeed, this week, the Supreme Court handed down a decision requiring all states to have unanimous jury verdicts in criminal cases by applying the Sixth Amendment. The one exception, unique in the developed world, is capital punishment, which is now a matter of local option. one can imagine that more issues, abortion rights, narcotics regulation, affirmative action, sanctuaries that defy the enforcement of federal immigration laws, will all become subjects for local option. Some states will mandate that a certain percentage of their legislature must be composed of women or members of particular ethnic groups. Some states will allow prayers in the school. Since the end of the Cold War, Americans have been sorting themselves into ever more homogeneous communities. This will have the ironic effect of actually reducing the uniformity of human rights guarantees among the states as a whole, resulting in a more diverse national state with less diverse constituent states. This would be a replay of the historic move west that led Frederick Jackson Turner and Walter Prescott Webb to their frontier thesis, only this time, migration would be for constitutional culture rather than for farmland. One might have expected the American system of federalism to have been a great assistance in coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. As Daniel Allen recently wrote in The Atlantic, viruses spread through social networks. Efforts to control them that take into account existing social structures perform better than those that do not. The system of federalism should have been an asset because it enables us to tailor responses to the viral context. She thinks that the federal system failed us because the president did not set the broad guidelines for states to follow and did not educate the public from his bully pulpit. There's something to this. It's hard to imagine how a president could have done a worse job. The guidelines the president should have determined for the states are no secret. And despite his unspeakable efforts to rouse mobs to defy state-ordered shelterings, he did not organize those mobs. They are, in fact, a feature of federalism as is refracted through the broken legitimacy of the current constitutional order. The national government can enforce very limited mandates on the states when they refuse to act in accordance with national law. President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division into Little Rock on just such an occasion, when Arkansas authorities refused to accept court-ordered mandates to desegregate the public schools. But it is idle to think that that sort of coercion could have made millions of persons wear masks or refrain from gathering in social groups of more than 6. That kind of cohesion comes from a federalism that, in the words of the Great Seal, is founded on solidarity. E pluribus unum, the motto of the federal system. Federalism in a collapsing constitutional order operates in exactly the opposite direction. Its motto might be ex uno pluribus. This might mean Catholic states, evangelical states, Black states, Hispanic states, feminist states. It's a big country. But I believe this would cripple the United States as an effective leader and protector of world order. Scenario planning is one way to conceptualize these developments, to identify those markers that entail or portend them, and shape them in a way that preserves the values of our founding. The COVID-19 pandemic, or something like it, was a certainty. It would come when it would come. What could not have been predicted was the utter foolhardiness of the responses of states, including those that might have been expected to do better, precisely because they had enormous capacity, expertise, and an educated populace. Unless we appreciate the deep changes underway in the legitimacy of the constitutional order, we will be surprised again when a not very surprising catastrophe overtakes us. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much to Professor Bobbitt. Our next speakers are Jeremy Green and Dora Varga. Jeremy Green is the William H. Welch Professor of Medicine and the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins, and is the author of Generic, the Unbranding of Modern Medicine, and Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs, and the Definition of Disease. He's currently finishing a book, The Electronic Patient, Medicine and the Challenge of New Media. I saw a thick sheaf of papers that was that manuscript sitting on Jeremy's porch. I think that you see him sitting out right now just a few days ago. And Dora Varga is the Senior Lecturer in Medical Humanities at the University of Exeter and co-editor of the journal Social History of Medicine. And her book, Polio Across the Iron Curtain, from Cambridge University Press in 2018, was awarded the book prize of the European Association for the History of Medicine and Health. And recently, Dr. Varga has been contributing to the work of the WHO and planning for the future after COVID-19, a topic about which they will be speaking now.
Thanks so much, Angus. You can hear me, right? I'm unmuted. Excellent. So our contribution today has to do with the problem of what post-COVID itself means in this conversation. How do we know when a pandemic is over? This seems like a simple question, but looking back at a century's worth of epidemics would suggest otherwise. And so Zoom permitting, Dora and I are going to try to tag team 5 framing tensions here in the next 7 minutes. And I'm just going to list them just in case it doesn't work. The first is the tension between social and biological faces of the epidemic. The second is between single and multiple endings to an epidemic. The third between national and international responses. The fourth between the hopes and realities for technological interventions. And the fifth between what we talk about when we talk about epidemics and what we talk about when we talk about endemics and the transition between the two. So I'll start with this first frame, the social and the biological. First, epidemics are never just biological events. They are always closely bound up in social determinants, in social meanings, and in social responses. And it's important for us to realize that there can be different time courses for the underlying biological face of the epidemic. How many are infected, the nature and mode of transmission, the rise and fall of incidence and prevalence, and our tools for prevention and treatment. And the social face of the epidemic. When do we become aware of this as an epidemic? How do we begin to diagnose, screen, measure it? Which people, which groups of people do we accurately measure it in and which do we not? And then what do we collectively do about this? And I want to point out these two faces of an epidemic are always closely intertwined. They're really inseparable, but they're not the same. The biological epidemic can shut down daily life by sickening and killing people. The social epidemic also shuts down daily life, as we have all seen, by overturning basic premises of sociality, economics, governance, discourse, interaction, and can also kill people in the process as well. And the slippage between these two faces of an epidemic makes our knowledge of endings difficult, and it can be dangerous to mistake one for the other. As we know from both the Spanish influenza of 1918-1919, the more recent swine flu of 2008-2009, and the events unfolding in Texas and Florida and elsewhere right now, we face substantial costs in relaxing our social responses to an epidemic before the biological threat itself has passed. And part of this problem is mistaking the peak for the end. Part of it is not seeing the difference in the timescales between the two time courses of beginnings, peaks, middles, and ends.
So what is this end that we are talking about? We have a tendency to borrow military metaphors for fights against disease. And in the past months, we have seen World War II parallels emerge in discussions around COVID-19. These metaphors conjure a coordinated effort of sacrifice, solidarity, and common action, and might stoke xenophobic sentiments as well. Military metaphors describing infectious diseases also imply the assumption that both epidemics and wars must have a singular endpoint. This is not true for wars, of course. After World War II, for instance, food rationing continued and millions of people were displaced and living in DP camps all around Europe for over a decade, while the last Japanese soldier laid down arms in 1974. Epidemics have similarly murky endings. Once thought to be over, new waves followed outbreaks of the Spanish flu in 1918, which Jeremy had mentioned, and its effect on social trust and the economy was felt for generations. Other diseases have even less clear endpoints, like polio, when the disease process itself is hidden. Similarly to COVID-19, a lot of the carriers are asymptomatic. Or it threatens to come back in a new epidemic wave, or ends not on a single day, but in different timescales and at different ways for different people. Once we enter the realm of ending or the post-epidemic, people in areas still affected with the disease due to disability, chronic conditions, or trauma are often forgotten or written out of the tidy narrative of the singular endpoint. So we must be very mindful of how we phrase this ending.
So the third frame of national international comes down to this concept of who can tell when a pandemic has ended. And today, at least going by international law, strictly speaking, only the WHO who has that ability. The Emergency Committee of the World Health Organization is responsible for the global governance of health and the international coordination of epidemic response. And the current framework that we have with international law comes directly as a result of the SARS coronavirus pandemic of 2002-2003, in which the WHO is granted sole power to declare the beginnings and endings of what are called public health emergencies of international concern. And this is the framework in which pandemics are declared or undeclared. Now, if we look at what's happened since then, the WHO has been criticized both for declaring pandemics too hastily, as in the case of H1N1, or comes under attack for declaring pandemics too late, as in the case of the recent Ebola pandemic. But the WHO's decision to declare the ending of a public health emergency of international concern, by contrast, is rarely subject to the same public scrutiny. So when an outbreak is no longer classified as a quote unquote extraordinary event and is no longer seen to pose a risk of international spread, the PHEIC is considered no longer to be justified, which leads to a withdrawal of international coordination. And part of the shift from ending of pandemic is that shift from international to national frames. Now, the WHO is the only global health body that is accountable to all governments of the world. Recall that the World Health Assembly contains every health minister of every country. But even though internationally sourced scientific and public health authority is key to its role in pandemic crises, WHO guidance is ultimately carried out in very different ways and on very different timescales in different countries, provinces, states, counties, and cities. If each country's experience of lockdown to date has already been deeply heterogeneous, one of the questions Dora and I want to put forward is, how does the reconnection between these places after the pandemic has ended occur in any way that will be any less heterogeneous? Instead, we anticipate high degrees of heterogeneity as these differential lockdowns come back into online in different timescales.
And picking up on that point, I'd like to come to our fourth frame, which is technological fixes. And as we are expecting or hoping for, rather, a vaccine, I think it's important that we talk about the heterogeneity, the variance in how it plays out. So, contrary to our expectations, vaccines are not universal technologies. Vaccination practices and infrastructures in place to deliver them are as diverse as the epidemic management strategies that national governments follow. A good historical example is polio. The development of the Salk vaccine did not itself put an end to epidemic outbreaks. There were contexts across the globe where it did not work. This problem with efficacy then paved the way for testing and uptake of the Sabin vaccine, which was the result of collaboration across political dividing lines in the Cold War. Its usage, however, mapped again on Cold War fault lines, partly due to political mistrust and partly due to how states organized their healthcare. By the time Sabin vaccine was licensed in the US, it was widely used in national vaccination systems and eliminated polio in much of the socialist world. One of the explanations for this success, both in organizing the trials and evaluating the results and mass vaccination, was authoritarianism. Authoritarian measures have been discussed as efficient, if problematic, solutions in epidemic management for over 70 years. Yet the story that the Cold War politics of polio shows us is that the vertical, heavily top-down organization of vaccination was combined with an emphasis on prevention in healthcare, universal healthcare system, so combined with a horizontal approach as well. This aspect, together with the socialist world's role in polio eradication, has been forgotten from the way we think about this particular success story and about the end of polio.
So, and finally, to offer our fifth frame of epidemics and endemics, we often forget when we talk about simple endings of epidemics that many epidemics only end through widespread acceptance of a newly endemic state. And I think an important historical case in point here is the global threat of HIV/AIDS. From a strictly biological perspective, the AIDS epidemic has never ended. The virus continues to spread devastation through the world. In the year 2018 alone, 1.7 million people, 1.7 million new people were infected, and 770,000 lives were claimed. And this is only by the official statistics, which are understood to be an undercount. But HIV is not generally described these days as an epidemic with the same urgency and fear that accompanied the newly defined AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s. And many other historians have made comparisons between this moment of recognition of coronavirus as an emerging pandemic and the moment of AIDS as a defining emerging infectious disease in the 1980s. Like coronavirus today, AIDS at the time was a rapidly spreading and unknown emerging threat, splayed across newspaper headlines and magazine covers, claiming the lives of celebrities and ordinary citizens alike. Nearly 40 years later, it has become largely understood as an endemic chronic disease, at least in those parts of the global north in which treatment and management is available. Like diabetes and other chronic disease, which claimed an estimated 4.9 million lives in 2019, HIV/AIDS became a manageable condition if one had access to the right medications. And of course, that if is a substantial question for both diabetes and HIV/AIDS today. Even in the first decade of the AIDS epidemic, though, activists in the United States fought tooth and nail to make their suffering visible in the face of both the Reagan administration's dogged refusal to talk publicly about the AIDS crisis and the indifference of the press after the initial sensation of a newly discovered virus had become common knowledge. In this respect, we want to pause and reflect that the lifetime of the epidemic, the social epidemic, does not necessarily end when biological transmission has ended, or even when it's peaked, but often when, in the attention of the general public or the judgment of certain media or political elites that shape attention, the disease ceases to be newsworthy as an aberration from the normal.
And just as a conclusion, at their best, epidemic endings are a form of relief for the mainstream we that can pick up the pieces and reconstitute normal life. At their worst, epidemic endings are a form of collective amnesia, transmuting the disease that remains into merely somebody else's problem. We need to consider the multiplicity of epidemic endings and ask for whom an epidemic ends, who makes the decision, and who is left out of that ending. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much to Jeremy and Dora. We'll now move on to Neil Ferguson, Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He's the author of 15 books, including The Pity of War, The House of Rothschild, Empire, Civilization, Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, and most recently, The Square and the Tower. For the past 5 years, he's written a weekly column for the Sunday Times, London. It's just been announced that he's becoming a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Today, we'll hear from him about the implications of what he describes as an emerging Cold War II.
Thanks, Angus. I'm going to talk briefly about the arguments of my paper. It helps if you've already read Liu Cixin's extraordinary science fiction masterpiece, The Three-Body Problem. If you haven't, then you should. If you have, then you'll get my drift. When I say that there's something now rather familiar about its plotline, the disaster in The Three-Body Problem is started by China. It's a Chinese scientist who signals to the Trisolarans that Earth exists and its location. But when the Trisolaran invasion is about to be launched, it's Chinese scientists who come to the rescue, at least temporarily, of Earth. This is a version of the plot that we've just seen play out in the COVID-19 pandemic. It clearly originated in Wuhan, China, despite the fake news stories that the Chinese Foreign Ministry saw fit to post on social media back in March and April. But China has sought to ride to the rescue with all kinds of rather propaganda-laden deliveries of emergency medical supplies to countries such as Italy and Spain that had been hard hit by the pandemic. I want to suggest that our version of the three-body problem is a geopolitical version, and I'm going to leave the metaphor aside for a moment, but come back to it towards the end. I start from the assumption that Cold War II had already begun before the outbreak of the pandemic. I refer you to an interview with Dr. Kissinger himself, which took place in Beijing at the end of November last year, in which he argued that we were, and I quote, in the foothills of a Cold War. I admit that I was the interviewer and asked the question, but the answer was nevertheless one of the most interesting answers of last year. I think COVID-19 has revealed to those who doubted it that Cold War II has begun, that we are in its foothills. And I think that the really striking feature of the discussion that there has been about geopolitics since the pandemic has been how many previous proponents of engagement between the US and China, or what I once called Chimerica, have come to accept this. Think of Orville Schell's recent essay on the death of engagement. What's really striking in a lot of the commentary, though, is doubt that the United States can win Cold War II. Declinism has made a comeback in 2020, from Bill Burns to John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge to Larry Summers to Anne Applebaum, Fareed Zakaria. I actually have lost count of the number of articles that I've read in the last 6 months that have said the Trump administration's mishandling of the pandemic illustrates that the United States is done, and conversely, variations on the Kishore Mahbubani theme of the Asian century have been the corollary. Very few people have taken the other side of this argument. Gideon Rachman bravely did, and my former colleague and Graham Allison's good friend Joe Nye has done so. But the overwhelming majority of commentators think if this is a Cold War, it's one the US is losing. And this, I try to show in the piece, links up to the interesting revival of cyclical theories of history in a number of different and quite divergent domains. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world, is writing a kind of autodidactic financial history of the world, which comes to the conclusion that cash is trash, specifically the US dollar, and you should all expect debt monetization and the decline and fall of the United States. And Peter Turchin, the proponent of cryptodynamics, actually comes to a very similar conclusion using quite different methods. I try to argue in the paper that the real story here is that both China and the United States did badly in the pandemic, and so too did, in its different way, the European Union. And the reason is that being a large and relatively open empire, at least two of them are relatively open, puts you at a significant disadvantage in a pandemic. When a new pathogen comes along, there are diseconomies of scale. And the emperors, Marcus Aurelius and Justinian, would confirm that if they were on this Zoom call. The really key thing to notice is that the countries that have done best by any meaningful measure of performance have been relatively small countries. I call them city-states because in terms of the scale of states in the 21st century, countries like Israel, Singapore, and Taiwan are relatively small and somewhat city-state-like. They were countries with good reason to be paranoid about just about everything, and certainly about their immediate neighbors, but also about coronaviruses, since they'd all learnt the lessons of SARS and MERS, unlike the United States and unlike the European Union, and unlike, it turned out, the People's Republic of China. So the key question, if city-states are the winners on balance, is what kind of a world would they prefer? Would they prefer a US-dominated world or a Chinese-dominated world or some other world? Now, it's generally, I think, the view of almost all academics that the Trump administration has been a vast wrecking ball to all conceptions of international order. I'm something of a dissident on this view because I don't think one should judge the Trump administration by the yardstick of preserving international liberal order. The stated objectives since the national security strategy of 2017 were quite different, namely to engage in and win a strategic competition with China. And I argue in the paper that in 4 areas, actually, the United States is winning a strategic competition with China. For the sake of brevity, I'll just list them. The details are in the paper. Financially, it's not the People's Bank of China you turn to for swap lines and repo facilities in the financial crisis of March 2020. No, it was the Federal Reserve. Has dollar dominance of international trade diminished even as the Fed has generated vast expansion of the supply of dollars? Answer, no. Second point, who will win the vaccine race? Nobody knows. My money is on a Western, not a Chinese company. And it is notable that around half of all the vaccine projects underway when Nature last surveyed the field were in North America. Third point, in leadership, tech dominance, the US has the upper hand because of China's chronic reliance on imported high-quality semiconductors from companies like TSMC. And Graham Allison recently wrote an excellent piece for the National Review suggesting that this really is the respect in which the United States can exert extreme pressure on the Chinese economy this year, though, as I'll come to in a minute, there's a major downside risk to exerting this pressure. Fourthly, as a very interesting survey by Macro Polo revealed just a few weeks ago, the US really does lead in terms of artificial intelligence talent. Much of it is grown in China, but harvested in US institutions and tech companies. Let me draw things to a conclusion with two remarks about the dangers of Cold War II, which are not different in many ways from the dangers of Cold War I. Danger number one is it turns into a hot war. That is always a risk in a Cold War, and it was a risk repeatedly during the first Cold War. It is a risk in the second Cold War, and an imminent one. If you don't believe me, read Christian Brose's new book and Graham's article that I just mentioned. Exert too much pressure on China through the silicon chip route, and you could trigger a geopolitical crisis over Taiwan. If you need those semiconductors and you can't get them because of US regulations, well, why not just take over Taiwan? Why not risk an amphibious landing? As Chris Brose and others have shown, it's not clear that the US can deter such a move. Michel Flournoy made the same point just the other day in Foreign Affairs. Finally, and crucially, and this brings me back to the three-body problem, what about the non-aligned movement, which was actually quite a significant feature of the Cold War, though it tends to get written out of most of the textbooks. The interesting point I conclude with is that in this Cold War, the non-aligned movement is likely to be a lot larger than it was in Cold War I. And that's very clear when you look not only at European sentiment gauged in recent polling, and especially German sentiment, which seems to aspire to equidistance between the US and China. It's also pretty clear if you talk to some Asian leaders, not least the Prime Minister of Singapore. So I conclude with the observation that geopolitics is itself a three-body problem. Power is not simply to be fought over between two superpowers, but ultimately, the outcome of Cold War II may be decided by the attitude taken of the third body, namely those various countries, including the successful city-states, who are currently veering in the direction of neutrality and non-alignment in this Cold War. And there I'll leave it.
All right, thanks very much, Professor Ferguson, and thanks to all our panelists who have, it's one of the first panels I've been on where everybody has pretty much stayed within time, which is appreciated. Our final speaker is Margaret Macmillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History and former Warden of St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. Professor Macmillan is the author of numerous books, including Women of the Raj, Paris 1919, 6 Days That Changed the World, Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History, and The War That Ended Peace, History's People, and in the fall of 2020, a book on war, How Conflict Shaped Us. And I think that's relevant to today's paper, where Professor Macmillan will be drawing lessons from World War I for the challenges posed by COVID-19.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel. You've all set a very high standard indeed, so I'll do my best, and I'll do my best to keep to time. The British government has, as it's been grappling with the pandemic, has been referring constantly to something that it calls, with capital letters, the science. And it has a Council of Scientific Advisors whose acronym is SAGE. And what I find interesting about this is both that the government seems to think there is something called the science, like the Oracle at Delphi, which will tell it what to do and will make no mistakes, but that they have consulted so little people who spend a lot of time thinking and studying human society. They have not been consulting sociologists, political economists, they haven't been consulting historians. And I think, in fact, they could have learned something from doing so, as I think this panel has demonstrated. I think history can be extremely helpful, first of all, just to tell us what is different about the particular crisis we're in from previous crises, what's new, what isn't. It can give us instructive examples of what worked and what didn't work in the past. Of course, we have to get the right examples, and there's always a danger that we will get trapped in the wrong analogy. And you have only to think of the appeasement analogy, which has trapped so many governments often into policies which have been ultimately bad and have caused them great damage. At the moment, we're using the war analogy a lot. And in some ways, I think it's helpful, but in some ways, not particularly helpful. I think the war analogy is helpful in that we need to mobilize the resources and the peoples of societies to a particular end. Where it's not helpful, as the paper on pandemics and endemics pointed out, it's not helpful in deciding when we've won and what we've lost. So I think we have to be very careful when we look at history in getting it right and using it with a great deal of care. And I think most of all, what history can do is help us formulate good questions. And when you're in the middle of a crisis, at least if you can ask good questions, you have some hope of being able to figure out what to do. And so looking at past crises, and I think those should be pandemics, they should be financial crises, and of course, they should be the outbreaks of wars. I think it is important to try and help us with our thinking today. And we've had, of course, we know pandemics in the past. The Black Death in the 14th century came suddenly to Europe, spread very rapidly, and there was a range of reactions, not unlike the range of reactions we've seen today. There was despair. There were those who tried to fight it. There were often divisions within society. Some governments resorted to turning people out of their cities who they feared were infected. But there were also those, as we've seen in this pandemic, who formed volunteer associations, who helped each other, who attempted to find ways to deal with it. And of course, their tools for dealing with it were much less than we have today. I mean, they thought that noxious odors caused the pandemic, and it wasn't in fact going to be until the end of the 19th century that we found out how the Black Death was spread. And so people carried bunches of roses, hence the song, of course, Ring Around a Rosie, which came out of this practice of carrying nosegays. The Spanish influenza, of course, is much more recent in our times. And again, although there were more tools for dealing with it, it was still much less, far fewer tools than we have today. And I think a lot of what happened then is what's happening today. In some places, local authorities reacted wisely and sensibly. In New York City, for example, there was a very effective chief medical officer who did, in fact, take steps which limited. In other cities, people paid absolutely no attention, which, of course, is what is happening today. In a funny way, I think, and I would argue, we're less well prepared in a very important sense. We're better prepared in the sense that our medicine and technology are more advanced and we can move more quickly to try and find ways of treating the illnesses we have, and we can find vaccines, we hope, much more quickly than we could have found in the past. But I think we're less prepared as societies, particularly those of us living in the prosperous West, in the prosperous North, to deal with uncertainty. And I think if you think of previous generations, they dealt with a lot more uncertainty in their lives, particularly, I think, in the area of health. I mean, they dealt with war, of course, they dealt with depressions. But when you think of how much people expected that women would die in childbirth, or that a lot of infants would not reach their first year. I mean, both my grandfathers had mothers who died when they were young. One died in childbirth and the other died when he was 2 years old. And I think there was much more acceptance of the sheer uncertainty of life, which perhaps, and I'm only speculating, made people in the past rather more resilient than we are. And I think dealing with uncertainty is something that we're going to have to accept. And I think it's not going to come easily for us. And I think you can see it in some of the sort of public reactions we've had today. My colleague at Oxford, Paul Collier, has talked about a period of radical uncertainty. And I think this is something that we need to think of. It may be that we don't come up collectively with a vaccine that works on this pandemic. And of course, I think we're all now beginning to realize that we will have other pandemics coming along, and we're still dealing, of course, with the great uncertainty of what this has done to our economies, how it's going to turn out, what's going to happen. And we're still dealing with perhaps the greatest uncertainty of all, and that is climate change. And this is something, I think, which is going to be a difficult period of adjustment for us. Maybe history can help us a bit. And so I have three questions that I think, looking at the First World War, perhaps can give us at least some ways of dealing with uncertainty. First of all, why did the First World War come as such a shock? And I think this is perhaps the most important question of all. Secondly, why did some societies cope better in that war and the tremendous demands that war posed? and others didn't? Why did Britain, Germany, and France, for all that they had internal troubles, for all that there were profound political and social divisions, why did they come out at the end of the war as countries still? Why did Russia not? And I think these are important questions. And then what, if anything, did people learn from the end of the First World War? Why do we sometimes learn? Why don't we sometimes do it? But I'd like to focus really on the shock of the First World War, because I think it really was. In the summer of 1914, a lot of Europeans thought the crisis in the Balkans was just that, a crisis in the Balkans, and it was the latest in a series of crises in the Balkans. And so there had been a war in 1912, there'd been a war in 1913 in the Balkans, in which the great powers had got involved. There had been threats of possible intervention. There'd been talk of a more general war. There'd been preparations, there'd been mobilizations of forces, but Europe had somehow got through it. The remnants of what had been the Concert of Europe had met, the ambassadors had met, and they had managed to patch up a peace and managed to force the quarreling Balkan nations into some sort of at least temporary peace. And what happened, I think, by 1914 was that the very nature of that series of crises, and there'd been earlier ones before 1912 and 1913, a series of crises in which the possibility of a general war had been raised, had made Europeans complacent. And over again, when you read what people were writing in the summer of 1914, what they're saying is it's a lovely weather, Wimbledon, it's the hottest Wimbledon ever, tennis competition, wonderful weather, people were going on holidays, they were going, if they could possibly afford it, to the seaside. And when the news first came from Sarajevo, a lot of people didn't take it seriously. It took the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, Henry Asquith, as he tended to be known, it took him until late in July to even mention it in the letters that he was writing to the woman that he was madly in love with. He was much more focused on the Irish question, much more focused on what was going on in England. And so I think there was a sort of complacency which was born out of having got through previous crises. And I think we see it with this pandemic. I think the initial reaction of a great many governments, and a great many of us, was that this is going to be like SARS. It's going to turn into something which in the end isn't all that serious. And look, we got through that. And so I think there was that. I think there was also the danger that those who were in the positions of making decisions were thinking on very rigid lines. They would increasingly thinking in tunnels and often separate tunnels. And so you got the military making plans in a number of countries, which they did not really inform their governments about. I think if you look at the case of Germany, which perhaps is the most egregious one, the government of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, did not know about the so-called Schlieffen Plan, the plan that Germany would fight a two-front war and only a two-front war. It had given up basically making plans to fight a one-front war by 1912. The Chancellor only found out about this plan in 1912. And when he did, he said, well, it's the obligation of the government, the responsibility of the government to make sure that the military plan is carried out properly if we get into a war. And so what I think you got was the military making the plans. I think you got in certain countries, the governments failing to exercise the proper civilian control of what was happening. And that, I think, helped to create the problem. What you also had was something which psychologists know about, and that's the confirmation bias that comes with dealing with people who tend to think like you and explaining away evidence that doesn't fit the lines you're already thinking on. And there was plenty of evidence, as we know, and people were, I think, even among the military, I'm easily aware of it, that war was developing in such a way that the edge was going to the defensive, that it was getting very costly and very difficult to attack well-defended positions because of the state of the technology, that armies that dug themselves in could hold off much larger forces and inflict dreadful casualties on them. I think there were also warnings that the balance between the two alliance system in Europe was so finely balanced that the likelihood of a stalemate, particularly with defensive war, was very likely indeed. And there was evidence. There was evidence from the American Civil War. There was evidence from the much more recent Russo-Japanese War. There was evidence from the wars in the Balkans themselves. And the military, and often their civilian supporters, tended simply to explain the evidence away. One European general said there's no point looking at the American Civil War because those people don't know how to fight a war anyway. And I do think we see this characteristic, it's a very human characteristic of people explaining away evidence that simply is inconvenient and allowing themselves to think along particular lines. And so in spite of the evidence that a war might be extremely costly, could well develop into a stalemate, the military continue to think in terms of offensive plans. They continue to think in terms of decisive battles. And I think this is one of the things that contributed to it. And at the end, I think, of the war, when it finally ended, a much longer war than anyone had expected, there was, again, an unwillingness perhaps to learn some of the lessons of that war. I think there was an unwillingness to fully support the League of Nations on the part of the European powers. And of course, as we know, sadly, the United States didn't join it. And there was a tendency of nations to go back to their traditional power politics. The British turned away from Europe altogether, as they tend to do at periodic times, and concentrated more on their empire and looked more across the Atlantic. But I think understanding why the First World War came as a shock and why people ignored the very real evidence, I think, that the war might not be what they hoped it would be, I think will help us perhaps as we understand why we're taken so by surprise by this pandemic and why we need to really start to think about how we prepare ourselves for other shocks and other surprises. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much again to all of our panelists for 5 excellent papers. We have a number of great questions from the audience. It struck me that most of the questions relate to US-China relations, also a theme of Frank Gavin's opening remarks and much of what Eric Schmidt was saying in his keynote address. And so I'll just begin by diving into some of those questions. First, I'll raise one of my own that ranges across a few of the papers, including those that don't talk so explicitly about China. Not as to say, looking beyond the issue of geopolitical relations, I was struck that several of the papers use the contrast to engage in deeper reflections about what the pandemic is telling us about the contrasting effects of democratic and authoritarian modes of governance. Margaret Macmillan, for instance, suggested that COVID-19 does demand authoritarian and arbitrary measures, which in more ordinary times we would shrink from in the papers she distributed, while at the same time suggesting that China's partial successes in managing the virus were attributable more to cohesiveness and conformity to social norms than to authoritarian methods themselves. Jeremy Green's and Dora Varga's paper also dwelled on both the unique capacities of authoritarian states to marshal rapid responses to pandemics, and also a skepticism that authoritarian methods were really necessary to achieve those goals. And certainly Graham Allison suggested democracies are slow to adapt, but more formidable once a broader public has come to understand the nature of the challenge confronting them. Neil Ferguson places all this within a set piece of an emerging great power clash between competing ideological systems. So my question for the panel is, what does history teach us about the advantages and disadvantages of authoritarian and democratic modes of government in moments of crisis? And what might this contrast tell us about the trajectory of the response to COVID-19 from this point forward?
I'm happy to have a stab at that, Agus, if you'd like. I think there's actually an error quite widely spread now that there was an advantage to being authoritarian in the pandemic, and it's not borne out by the evidence. The star performers were democracies. I mentioned them: Taiwan, South Korea, Israel, and that's to be contrasted with some disastrous authoritarian performances. Think of Russia, which has done dismally. And actually, there's no correlation at all between political systems and performance, because some democracies did really badly in Europe, Italy and Spain and Belgium, and others did really well. So this is a red herring, and there's a good reason for that, because actually, when you look at the Blavatnik School in Oxford's work, the real success against COVID-19 doesn't come from the stringency of government measures at all. It comes from two different things. First, the extent to which testing and contact tracing could be ramped up rapidly, which doesn't have anything to do with authoritarian versus democratic governments. It's just a question of competence and having understood the lessons of SARS and MERS. And secondly, the behavior of citizens in adapting to the new pathogen. Austin Goolsbee has a great new paper out showing that actually shelter-in-place lockdown orders didn't really have a decisive role in changing behavior. It was just that people, as John Cochrane argued early on, adapted in response to the threat. And that pace of adaptation, I don't think can be explained in the kind of typical way that we say Asians are more deferential to authority, because it's not actually about being deferential to authority. It's about acting rationally in the face of a new pathogen. In the US, a major obstacle to rational behavior is partisan polarization, where mask wearing and other behaviors are issued by Republicans. But this is a peculiarity of American politics, not a general pathology of democracies. So that would be my answer.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dora, I believe you had a response to this as well.
Yes, thank you. I just want to add to that authoritarian measures have been discussed as a way of dealing with epidemics for many, many years, including the first World Health Assembly, where this was discussed. We don't want to go there. We just came out of World War II, but this is the best way to deal with an epidemic outbreak. And these kind of authoritarian measures were also interestingly used, this idea of authoritarianism, to accept Soviet vaccine results, to which there was a lot of mistrust when they tested the Southern vaccine, for instance. But I think these discussions around authoritarian measures work with a lot of assumptions about what authoritarianism is and how it works, and how effective it is in many ways. If you look deep down, there is a lot of ways when it that proves to be wrong. But also there is other things going on, I think, which are much more important, which are comes with the solidarity and also a kind of care to vulnerable populations. And this is, for instance, where you see in the late 19th century, where you don't have cholera uprising, is in cities where there is a kind of social care and access to healthcare, but also food and work, where that works. And they also work with the lowest numbers. This is also true in 17th century Florence, for instance, with the plague. So I think there is a kind of combination, that these are all working with the kind of combination of a really stringent top-down, but also providing care and access to health.
Professor Allison, I know you want to jump in on this, but let me just raise a couple other questions about U.S.-China relations too that I think are germane to your paper, in case you want to add them in too. So we got a bunch of questions along the lines of, will the post-coronavirus world be one of cooperation or competition? How has the pandemic invited competitors to test the limits of U.S. resolve or commitment? Do you think that other parties are finding ways to help fill the U.S. leadership vacuum, so on and so forth? And then we got one fairly elaborate, but I think important question along these lines. It says, the Cold War saw several examples of tremendous success in public health campaigns, such as those eradicating polio and smallpox in the midst of intense geopolitical competition between the US and Soviet Union. Is the failure for the US and China to transcend similar political tensions a failure of individual leaders? Or is it a result of deeper structural differences in the character of the epidemic or the competition between the countries compared to the Cold War? So that's obviously a lot to throw on the table. It's just to show the range of questions we've been getting about US-China relations in relation to the comments that all of you have made. Professor Allison, I don't know if you want to respond to that, and then that's an invitation for others to jump in as well.
Well, those are big questions, so I'll just be, I can't do justice, but I think, let me go back to the first issue and then connect the two. I think that this is a great example of what I've been trying to write a paper I've done called One Corona Crisis, Two Systems Responses. I even have a little bit about this in the paper. I think because there's such a, what the Wall Street Journal editorialists call a febrile sense of failure in the US, we've been having difficulty recognizing the extent of China's success in dealing with this and the extent of the American failure. So if I go through the checklist, so China, like Taiwan, like Hong Kong, like Singapore, have adopted an objective that's entirely different from the objectives that we're prepared to embrace in dealing with coronavirus. namely zero tolerance. So when there's another outbreak, they go in, flood the zone. They're perfectly happy to quarantine people, which we don't do, or rarely. They're perfectly happy to contact trace using all of their information systems, which we don't do. In fact, we use contact tracing as if it were an operational option. In fact, it's a fantasy option. You have somebody calling up people asking, did you meet this person? And you can hardly find, imagine you're trying to do contact tracing for anybody you know. Go through it in just common sense and you can see how unreasonable the concept is operationally if you don't make use of technology. So as Eric has said often, if you gave the task to Google, Apple, and Amazon to contact trace people, you could get 90% of the people in 24 hours. If you give it to somebody working for the US government who calls up and says, I want to know about your contact with this person or that, the idea that you're within the 14-day window when the person might be contagious and you're going to find many people, forget about it. Forget about it. It's a fantasy. So I would say there's a whole lot of fantasy in this space, and it's hard to recognize, but there's significant. If a society has a surveillance state, they're able to surveil who may be infecting whom and to separate them. If they're prepared to require people not to instruct them or advise them to quarantine. Here you have Governor Cuomo last week saying, well, we're simply not going to let people from other states come to our state. Excuse me? Go look at what's happening at LaGuardia or JFK Airport or at the bus station. And we're going to require them to quarantine themselves for 14 days. What does it mean, require them? New Yorkers are quarantined? Anybody is enforcing anything? Oh no, we can't enforce it. We're just advising them. We're instructing them. So I think this, unfortunately, is helping us see that many of the advantages of a culture like ours, which is open, individualistic, in which we're not that respectful of government, in which we're even distrustful of government, are disadvantages for us in dealing with a task like this. And I think I give you just one last example. So Taiwan is a wonderful example. It's a democratic society, but with a lot more authority than anything you would see in the US. Singapore is a quasi-democratic society with a lot more authority than anything you would see in the US. Taiwan, the total population is about the same size as New York State and New Jersey together. How many people have died in Taiwan from coronavirus? 7.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much, Professor Allison. I wanted to give Margaret and Jeremy a chance to jump in here if they wanted to. And then I had a quick final question that came in that I think is especially relevant to Professor Bobbitt's paper as well. So, but first, Margaret or Jeremy, I don't know if you have any comments you'd like to add.
Just briefly, what I'd say, if I can, is that I think where democracies are flexible is that they can, in times of crisis, adopt arbitrary and authoritarian means, and then they can abandon them. And I think on the whole, I agree with Neil Ferguson that the authoritarian states that are always authoritarian have not dealt all that well and have, I think, always a temptation to cover up and protect the great leader.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I would just say, very, very quickly, when we look at the case of smallpox eradication, which is seen as this great, paradoxical success of cooperation in the height of the global Cold War, it's important to also contrast that against malaria eradication, which played out, in a very different way and was very much seen as a great failure of the World Health Organization, but also a failure that was mired in Cold War competition. American-led designs for global malaria eradication were fundamentally predicated on it being an anti-communist venture. So it's hard to say it was simply that back then there was cooperation and now there isn't, and that is the problem of the moment. I think it requires a finer understanding of the way that these national-international tensions are constantly playing out.
All right, if I see it's 1:30 p.m., can I ask the organizers, do I have time for one brief question for Professor Bobbitt here, or should we wrap up right away?
I think if it's really quick.
Yep, okay. We had a very brief question from a panelist that I think is relevant. A lot of the papers, whether Professor Ferguson's comment about small states The paper from Jeremy Green and Dora Varga referenced local versus universal scales. This all comes in, I think, to this question, but I'm going to direct it towards Professor Bobbitt since it's, I think, especially relevant. Is our failure to control the COVID virus because of inept leadership or inept government structure? Can new leadership arrest this decline, or is there a systemic fault that needs to be evaluated?
In my view, even a superb leader would have had a very difficult time with this particular phenomenon. As I say, it has to do with the collapse of the legitimacy of the state itself. And it's not just America, it's you see all across the world. And I think we're just not facing up to this.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great to see this group. Wish you were all here, or we were all together somewhere.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our panelists for a stimulating discussion. Please do stay tuned for the next panel on global public health, ethics, food security, and transnational mitigation strategies, which begins in roughly 15 minutes at 1:45 p.m. Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you, Angus.
Thanks. Great seeing everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We're going to take a short break until for 13 minutes, and then at 1:45, please join us again for global public health, ethics, food security, and transnational mitigation strategies. And thank you to Angus for doing a masterful job of chairing a panel which included just outstanding papers and an ideal start to the conference. So thank you all, and I'll see everyone in 12 minutes. Thanks.